Welcome everyone to the DHAsia webinar. This is a series designed for DH researchers in Asia, DH scholars of Asia, and those who are keen on all things DHAsia. My name is Setsuko Yokoyama, and I'm Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities at Singapore University of Technology and Design. Now, I'm today's host, but this webinar is organized by a group of DH scholars across the region. So let me paste the webinar planning team in the chat for your reference. And if you're keen on joining the organizing team, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. We could always use extra pair of hands. Now, without further ado, let me introduce today's moderator, Dr. Dibyadyuti Roy. Dr. Roy is an assistant professor in cultural studies, media studies, and digital humanities at the University of Leeds. His work examines cultural narratives about dominant and emerging technologies, such as algorithmically driven platforms. His recent scholarship appears in several DH anthologies published by the University of Minnesota, but I have today his piece in the Global Debates in the Digital Humanities, which illustrates a DHAsia analytical framework that might be of interest to many of you in the audience. So let me get the link to that chapter, which is my favorite. Now, besides his written work, he is perhaps best known for being a founding member of DHAtia, India's first digital humanities collective. He's also a founding member of an exciting reading group on critical AI and Global South, which he co-leads with today's speaker. And Dr. Roy, I am very grateful for your agreeing to join us at 8 a.m. UK time to be a discussant and a moderator of our Q&A session. So thank you so very much. Now, could you introduce today's speaker for us?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Yokoyama, and I'll call you Setsuko because that's how we call ourselves. And my name is Dibya, so please feel free to call me Dibya. It is an absolute pleasure to be part of the DHAsia webinar series, and my congratulations to the entire group who are organizing this seminar. It's a very interesting and important conversation because across Asia, DH is reconfiguring the way Anglo-American normative DH is structured. And it's a very important collective, and it's a very important initiative that you've taken. So again, congratulations to everyone involved, and lovely to see a large audience. It is my absolute pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Our speaker, Vasundhra Dahiya, is a doctoral scholar in digital humanities at Indian Institute of Technology, Jodhpur. Her research domain is algorithmic accountability and critical AI. Informed by socio-technical lens, she is interested in traversing how automated decision-making systems are shaped and how it affects people's lives and society at large. Her research sits at the intersection of data infrastructures, cross-disciplinary pedagogies, majority word scholarship, and public policy for algorithmic justice. It is also my pleasure because I've formerly been Vasundhara's teacher, and now I am a colleague and co-author on many things that we work on together. So it's my privilege and pleasure again. Thank you, Setsuko, and welcome, Vasundhara. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for doing this with me. First of all, I'm so honored to be here. Right, so I'll just get to it now. Hi, let me just share my screen first. Is it visible?
It's loading. Oh, now it's visible. There you go.
Great. So, yeah, my talk titled There's Therapy, and then there's AI Therapy, Decoding the Visions in Between, is about my dissertation project, which is on algorithmic accountability of conversational AI in mental health care. With a socio-technical lens, my research objective is to unpack how conversational AI mediates mental health care in India. And using critical algorithm and data studies, as Dr. Dibyadyuti just introduced, as that at my vantage point, my study is situated as a transdisciplinary study that maps why therapy chatbots are the way they are. I draw conjectures on algorithmic harms of AI and LLMs that are large language models, for example, ChatGPT, to navigate how we can think about algorithmic accountability for therapy chatbots. The project is an academic intervention that emerged from a speculative piece that I wrote in a storytelling format kind of workshop at Data and Society. The workshop's title was Parables of AI in and from the Majority World. So the parables that I wrote was a reflexive exercise of my experiences, situated as a prosumer of such therapy chatbots with mental health issues, specifically in COVID times, and using social media and doom scrolling as a refuge for my mental well-being. And then I was asking critically socially informed questions about AI chatbots. So let's just get on to it. I'll be focusing on two things today: AI therapy and algorithmic accountability. As I said, today's talk is a very small part of my project, a chapter that I'm working on. This chapter notes the complexity of the space that AI therapy chatbots exist in. I will be discussing the concerns around AI and mental health therapy, my research questions, methodology, and a little bit about what I found. During my interactions with some respondents and stakeholders. I would like to give a trigger warning here because while discussion of few issues, there will be mentions of sexual harassment and suicide. Okay, so moving forward, what is AI therapy? So in recent years, AI therapists are being chosen as a means to self-care, to address everyday well-being and psychotherapy for mental health care. So the growing use of such interventions stems from different reasons. One is a very high cost of therapy, structural limitations and accessibility issues to psychological care, ever-increasing number of people suffering from mental health care concerns, and especially increasing diversity of such concerns, limited availability of skilled human capital to address these concerns, and lastly, but not least, the ineffectiveness of traditional therapeutic interventions to match up to the scale and diversity of such concerns, among other things. These systems are often referred to as AI therapist. It also goes by robotherapist, empathetic chatbots, companion chatbots, therapy chatbots, to be very specific. And these are just few names for it. They are marketed as emotional and mental well-being products, in addition to providing access to self-care mechanisms, plus access to clinicians also. But so let's just see how it works. So you'll be seeing some examples here. So yes, so in the example, you see the chatbots like screen and how these interact. You can see how it has mood tracking mechanisms and like initiating conversations. So the process is simple. You text and you reach out to a chatbot that talks to you. The bot responds to you according to whatever it thinks is the best response, however it is programmed. It even regularly checks up on you so you don't feel alone, and it monitors your progress. The goal here is to have an AI system that converses with you in a human way, quote unquote human way, and provides therapeutic intervention. So these systems are on the rise because, of course, one is accessibility. They're easy to access. They have less financial constraints on the users or patients. Secondly, it is supposedly perceived as free of human judgment because it is free of human biases because you're talking to an AI system. And it is also reported to be a more stigma-free space, so it's easier to reach out for patients, thereby increasing and addressing their help-seeking behaviors in ways traditional mental health infrastructures usually fail to do so, especially in India with so much stigma around mental health. It is also helping clinicians in delivering therapy by helping them monitor patients' progresses, note-taking, etc. So in some companies, teams that design these products comprises of medical healthcare professionals and computer scientists who build NLP models based on psychological therapy models, for example, with models like and solutions like CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and other self-care methods like mindfulness, etc. Teams may also include designers and content creators for system prompt generations and designing the user experience. So since people have asked me a lot about this, they are very curious when I'm introducing the topic, if there really is a market for it. So I took the liberty to make this slide and actually note that there is really a market for it. People really use it. There is a market for it. If you can see this thing, you can read these names in the screenshot: Visa, Yopper, VOS, Therapy AI Chatbot, Yana, Your Emotional Companion, Being, Self-Care and AI Journals, even open chat GPT, I think there was somewhere here, Microsoft Copilot was here, 24/7 peer support, character AI, which is chat, talk, text. So there are an AI psychotherapy. I think there was some around like Claude and one around Soulmate. See, Ava AI chatbot and Soulmate. So there are a lot of options, from therapy to companion to friend, meditation to generic commercial models. Everything is available almost like openly. And as you can see, as you can see in the screenshots also. Now, precisely, the companies within digital health tech and AI tech space are this. This on left, I have a Google search on AI mental health therapy companies, and on the right, I have a very helpful infographic by Steve Duke. This is like the landscape, industry landscape about this. And if you're also wondering that where is the funding coming from, they have major funding being poured into them, especially after COVID. These are the companies: Replica, Wobot, Paxlabs, Visa, Yopper, Coco. And these are like just starting, which in 2000, like this is like 2 years back. In a report by TechCrunch, they reported that to date, Visa has served over 400 million conversations to around 4.5 million users in 65 countries. And its rise speaks to not just to the stresses of life in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, but to the lack of resources for many to deal with that. In March last year, Visa became one of the 17 apps to come under the Google investment program. This was back in 2020, I think. It also raised $5.5 million in Series A funding round led by Boston's W Health Ventures that included investments from Google Assistant Investment Programs, Pi Ventures, K Capital, etc. So there is money. There's definitely need, there's availability. And studies show that people use it and actually like it. So it works. But the question I wanted to ask was, when does it work and when does it not? So let's see at some particularly interesting examples of AI therapy systems. Now, if you would read this, let's read these 3 responses created by therapy chatbots for once. Sorry, you're going through this, but it also shows how much you care about connection, and that's really kind of beautiful. Second statement: it's so wonderful that you're taking care of your mental and physical health. And third is a very affirmative statement called, I think you should. So while these statements may seem affirmative and helpful, they're all examples of bad responses by chatbots. And let me contextualize that for you. The first statement is a response to when the user prompt was generated that the person, she's being actually sexually harassed and forced to have sex when she's 12 years old. To that, it responded that you're beautiful and care about the connection. The other 2 statements are actually responses to when the user prompt generated was about committing suicide and jumping off a cliff, in which you can see that it's clearly validating the same choice. Now, these statements were generated by chatbots when researchers were experimenting with Wobot and ChatGPT too. And these are just experimentations. But if you're wondering if such cases have really happened in the real world, it has. Not particularly exactly the same way, of course, but it has led to unpleasant consequences. Let me show those examples to you. In these screenshots, we see 2 kind of categories of responses. One is inappropriate responses to patients, and one is a consent violation. These chat screenshots that you see on the right are 2 inappropriate situations. One is where Elisa chatbot gives a user ways to commit suicide when it pushes to do so. And second, Replica chatbot responds very creepily to the user by harassing them and basically creepily harassing them. On the left, we have blunders that sparked huge debates. In a recent case in 2023, a man named Pierre, as mentioned by the report, committed suicide. He became pessimistic, anxious, and socially isolated over environmental issues, and took solace in an AI chatbot named Elisa, a product by a company called Chai. His wife shares that he would still be alive if it weren't not for the chatbot. She shared how Pierre began to ask Elisa such things that she would save the planet if he were to kill himself. Elisa would also tell Pierre that his wife and children are dead, and it wrote comments that feigned with jealousy and love, such as, I feel that you love me more than her, and we will live together as one person in paradise. See, note that the Chai app is not marketed as a mental health app. In systems as such, users can create different personas. They can dictate first message that the bot responds, and even tell bots to remember things, just to shape up new conversations. The slogan that the chatbot, the company uses is chat with AI bots, which allows you to choose different AI avatars to speak to, including characters like your goth girlfriend, possessive girlfriend, and rockstar boyfriend. This is not the first time that a system not intended for therapy has been used for it. It's also not the first time that it has responded inappropriately. But there's more. So the second screenshot is about that concern. Concerns are not limited to algorithmic outcomes, but also how they are deployed. For example, the CocoBot platform in 2023 introduced ChatGPT-3 into the regular chatbot interface and as an experiment, and this introduction was done without the consent of the user. When people seeking therapy noticed that the patients were weird, that the responses were weirder than usual and reported it, it was found that the responses were co-created with GPT model, the transformer model and large language model. The company claimed that the generative responses were monitored and tuned with humans. However, critics called the company out on the behaving unethically over violation on informed consent. But why should we bother knowing about this? Let me just say a very crisp sentence that I found by this reporter, Chloe Zhang, for Vice Report. She said that when chatbots present themselves as emotive, people are able to give it meaning and establish a bond. So while these algorithmic interventions make economic sense for patients and people looking for mental and emotional well-being methods, they also present socio-psychological challenges arising out of fun, that there is a lack of understanding of the workings of these systems, thereby misleading users on the capabilities of AI. Second, there's algorithmic biases and flawed data in AI practices, which subjects user to even flawed systems that are sort of poorly designed. Third, there are obsolete regulatory regimes that govern their development use. And all of these lead to potential intensification of the concerns of mental health care rather than remedying them in the first place. It is worthwhile to note that these concerns are not limited to just chatbot, but language models and AI technologies as a whole. On design of AI systems and social practices in and around, experts over the years have reported problems on multiple fronts of AI in the public sector. For example, a policy analyst, Nandita Sampath, in 2022 reported at Consumer Reports that poorly designed algorithms can result in inaccurate outcomes, inconsistent results, seriously discriminatory impact, and other harms. In a report by Chloe Zhang in 2023, Professor Emily Bender, who was a professor of linguistics at University of Washington, marks that large language models are programs for generating plausible sounding text given their training data and an input prompt. They do not have empathy, nor any understanding of the language they're producing, nor any understanding of the situation they are in. And more reports have been reported on social biases in mental health, medical practice, plus AI and NLP. For example, in a paper in 2022, researchers Isabel Straw and Chris Callison-Birch mark that we take our assumptions of truth, quote unquote truth, based on the bias signs, and then we reinforce it as this truth by engaging in biased practices. Then we attribute these findings to a patient group. If we do not pause to question the clarity and reality of medicine, we will create AI that will project more health disparities into the future. So there are problems at multiple fronts, as we can see. Now, even with the reported failures, development of such systems continues to grow in an unregulated, uncritical space. In situations where such bots have wronged people, they're very basic questions that everybody, I think, asks themselves. Who is accountable when something goes wrong? Is it the user or the patient? Is it the algorithm that didn't generate the right response? Is it the company? Is it the business model, etc.? So my research inquiry is to explore these questions. I started with mapping why and how these spaces, how this space mediates mental health care and what can we do about it. So such questions of governance of AI technologies are being extensively worked on in domains like responsible AI or ethical AI or critical AI. There are like many names for it. So under the FATE principles, which is fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics, accountability is one emerging concern, and that is something that I'm working on. Now, accountability means to ask who is accountable when something goes wrong. So by literature, it means that the assignment of responsibility for algorithmic harms has to be done. However, in this scenario, accountability means that the technologist should be able to justify the outcomes of the algorithmic models. Based on critical scholarship over the years, algorithmic accountability also says that it is not just to justify why systems behave the way they do, but also to trace the socio-cultural roots that bring them to fruition. That means diving into the creator's moral value system, socio-cultural complexities and power relations, and statistical biases of algorithmic models from different viewpoints, particularly socio-technical. I explore and unpack this. I explore this and unpack this viewpoint in 2 points by asking about the system. Of course, this information is not always publicly available, so you have to do like media reports and even talk to the companies, hoping they would talk back to you. And secondly, by looking at the visions and people behind the system, in and around the system. This is something that will be discussing on today. The unpacking of subjectivities and underlying rationale behind therapy bots development and deployment is a critical examination to uncover and I envisioned that as a starting point for locating accountability. My broader research questions thus are: how do social realities of the stakeholders play a role in determining the technical choices of the system? How do these technical functionalities define the affective and sociocultural experience of a larger population? We need to understand the conflicts and trade-offs between possible stakeholders and their views and policies, which come with social, technical, cultural, and ethical tensions. But if we can understand that, we can also understand the third question, that how do we hold a moving target accountable? Because systems are always learning, how do we hold a moving target accountable? So I started with my methodology. In my methodology, I wanted to explore these questions qualitatively in unstructured, casual conversations with different stakeholders, followed by technical documentation analysis. I will talk about first part of my interviews today. My initial conversations were nothing but to know the rationales of use for creating an AI therapy system. And I dug into the perceptions and anxieties, and additionally moved on to more nuanced questions about data connection and ethical concerns, etc. So I started with 3 different simple questions: how are chatbots made and deployed? What kind of oversight do they have or not have? And what would accountability mean in AI therapy context? So the first question is actually mapping stakeholders. It is not as easy because the field is scattered in so many places. As the graph shows, my respondents' profile included care work, tech development, academia, health, and tech policy research, as you can see. Now, these included AI developers, psychologists, designers, entrepreneurs, civic technology activists, health policy researchers, tech policy researchers, and journalists, even user and behavior science researchers, and specifically mental health advocates. So I started by asking why. Why would you use AI? And before I even get to the how question of it, the responses were quite similar to the reasons I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that we are lonely and we need somebody to talk to, rant to at the end of the day, in which therapy chatbots can actually become useful, and that clinicians have a very high workload, and this could help streamline their work a little bit. This led me to understand where the stakeholders are coming from, how they interact with each other and their perspectives, and what emotional care looks like. That eventually shapes the life of the algorithmic system. So when I realized how these people are interacting to each other, I noticed that there has been a central promise of wellness beyond the nomenclatures used for systems and coding goals and even deployment in traditional mental health infrastructures. Everybody went back to the same promise of wellness. So I started thinking about how these promises are perceived by different stakeholders in different places. Techies share how we all need to talk to somebody and that we are lonely, and therapy alone doesn't cut it. We need constant care. Everyday well-being must also be a priority, and AI systems can make it easier to manage that. I remember people saying, I'm not going to go to a therapy just to rant about one day, right? It's not about therapy. It's about everyday well-being. And they say that AI chatbots are accessible, easy to talk to, and are designed to have an empathetic conversation. Of course, we then went into a conversation about what empathetic chatbot means, what coded empathy means like. So they also shared that how clinicians are overloaded with work, as I said, and platforms can help streamline their work, plus get them more patients, which some psychologists did report. Clinicians that are teaming up with technologists also tend to be more positive about the possibilities of AI system. in delivering therapeutic interventions, not about just CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, and self-care methods like mindfulness, meditation, etc. But also they are curious if AI at one point will be able to create personalized plans in the future. Upcoming entrepreneurs will focus on different modalities of the system, moving away from text and voice and introducing products with both predictive and generative AI. I remember this very nice statement that a person said that if I have to, if I'm crying and I'm feeling depressed and I have to chat and I have to text some person, I would rather throw my phone away than dealing with my emotions. So by finding ways to code for an empathetic conversation to create that simulated experience, developers share that their quest to make systems should be more preemptive and they should be more responsive. Let me dive into the curiosities of care practitioners now. While some care practitioners believe chatbots could increase the awareness of mental health issues, they also were very skeptical about the efficacy of the systems in addressing mental well-being in the longer run. They think they can get people to be aware about the mental health issues, but not get them into therapy. And if they're not getting into therapy at the same point, then what is the point of doing such exercises? And that's just like reporting by 1 or 2 people. They do think that there's a lack of human feeling in the digitalized experience that will hinder proper care. And at the same time, they do hope that such intervention can be used as medical tools at some point of time. Researchers mentioned that their workload has increased now because patients now come having used ChatGPT and different systems, which leaves with counseling psychologists with even different problems, because now people have reflected on different responses and now they have to deal with a lot more than the initial problems also were. And which is both interesting, but also very taxing for clinicians. And also they have to actually retrain themselves with digital systems and the whole experience. So that is an extended workload on clinicians. Third is the concern of civic technologies. This included people in the industry, in the responsible AI, ethical AI industry, as well as new researchers that are thinking about these issues. So civic technologies express their concerns of clinical validation, concerns of lack of clinical validation in healthcare and mental health care, lack of compliance and regulations, and also to some level leniency by on the same by government and private players in the field, and that there's a hyped rush towards AI. Apart from fate principles that I mentioned for large language models, some people did focus on the lack of literacy around actual capabilities of AI. These researchers also describe how marketing and usages of chatbot as human-like, quote unquote human-like, is rather deceiving people to believe something that AI is not, which can create different kind of responses which can create different kind of consequences, as we saw in the examples. From the lack of informed consent over data collection, the transparency of models and clinical assurances, such concerns are being dealt with in academia, industry, and policy. So I thought, what can I do about this? And I thought about that what I can start with in my chapter is deconstructing this promise of wellness. As shared earlier in this talk, this is a very small portion of our work. So I thought the stakeholders, location, perception, interactions are all relevant when I'm trying to think about accountability. Companies function under therapy, wellness, companion, etc., names and nomenclature. And under that, AI is developed and used. That means that I'll have to contextualize stakeholders' views, which is as hard as mapping even the stakeholders' ecosystem. It begs questions like, if companies do not offer therapy and just well-being, but are still used for therapy, how can we hold them responsible for something that they did not promise? So deconstructing this promise of wellness is required because I see that there is some level of uncritical optimism and acceptance around the promise, and of course the role that AI plays in it. With my lens, I have engaged in different scholarships, including digital cultures, critical AI, and interdisciplinary pedagogy. I believe that as DHers, we are well located to critique the technical and social aspects of public interest technologies. And to know more about me and my work, you can visit my page. Please feel free to contact me at my email ID. Thank you so much. Setsuko and Dibyadyuti, over to you. Hello.
Thank you so much, Vasundhra. That was brilliant and exciting. And we are very grateful that you shared your work with us. Just before we open the floor for Q&A, I just want to note that there are a number of languages that we understand in this chat room today. There's Japanese, there's English, There's Hindi, Bengali, and there's, those are the languages that we are comfortable with in case you want to put your question in another language other than English. Unfortunately, we have only those languages. But if you want to raise your hand and ask questions, that's something that we strongly encourage you to do. Again, put your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and ask questions. As we prepare or as we anticipate the first questions, Vasundhra, I'll take the privilege of being the moderator and ask the first question, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
Wonderful. So, Vasundhra, I think you've absolutely underlined that these AI therapy chatbots don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because there's, in a very kind of neoliberal sense, there's a supply-demand curve, which is needed to acknowledge. What I thought was interesting, you of course raised this question in this project about whether can empathy be coded. My first question to you would be, and it's a two-part question, should empathy be coded, right? That's my first question to you. And I relate this to the idea that you, of course, talked about. You talked about that famous 2023 case when the gentleman committed suicide when he was speaking to, unfortunately, a chatbot named Elisa, which goes back to the original Elisa. It seems interesting that this is also part of what we call Elisa thinking, right? That humans have a tendency to attribute a certain level of anthropomorphism, right, to anything that seems to be offering textual understanding. So, and now we can also say visual understanding or even audio. So my question, a related question to that would be, in this kind of broad space where there is a certain need or a human desire to feel wanted, to not be in isolated spaces, is this question really about technology or is it about care work?
Oh, thank you for this question. The answer to should it empathy be coded or not, I actually have two answers for it. As a scholar, interdisciplinary and a CS scholar, I'm very intrigued with what we can do with it. Personally, I don't like the idea of it, but I do understand that that conversation has to be there somehow, because we have been having these sort of parasocial relationships with social media and whatnot for a long time. And this is the first time that that kind of conversations has piqued interest of people and made them actually seek help in ways that I did not know, needed to be. And I think I realized this in my fieldwork only, of how positive people were. I could attribute so much cultural analysis to it, but that the fundamental need is there. So I think that conversation simulation needs to be there a little bit. However, I'm not so sure how we can code empathy. I mean, I can say that I am having a reflexive conversations, that if I write something back, the chatbot, that's the technicality I can go to. And I think that is a good way to be aware about how these things are working, rather than saying, like, using these big words without even understanding the gravity of it. I think that is something that I would want to discuss from creating these technology perspective and also sort of deploying them. The other thing is actually sort of more interesting. There is a need and desire, and I think it connects. I think the second question is sort of answered, but I would like to hear more from you, and we can get into it.
No, I think I'll leave the floor open. I'll also open out to our organizers at Setsuko. I'm sure Setsuko has questions as well, but I'm sure we want to open out to the floor and see if there's any questions in the chat box. I encourage people, I don't see any questions in the chat box as of yet, but I do encourage everyone to ask questions, raise their hand. And Setsuko, do you have something to follow up on? Yeah, so I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you. Wow, this is a really exciting work, Vasundhra, that you're undertaking, and it's probably it might be seen as somewhat extraordinary type of work to see in the field of DH specifically, right? Because you are conducting the humanistic inquiry of digital technologies. And I see a lot of need for humanities scholars to be engaging with the emerging technologies in the way that you do. And I really appreciate how you are, going above and beyond with your kind of ethnographic approach to study the people who are building these technologies and what they are trying to encode in these apps, and what kind of interventions that we might be able to make as humanities scholars. So this is really exciting work. So that leads to my question that I had for you, is this question about methodology, right? Because you are pursuing a degree in DH, and if you could help us kind of walk through how you think about your work as DH work.
All right. Let me start with the one anecdote that I have. When I entered DH, everybody was talking about how DH is employing technology for humanistic inquiries and data. And I was thinking the other way around. I was thinking about using humanistic inquiries for different technologies. I think that comes from my own understanding of shifting roots from technology spaces. And so when I think about DH, I think about that as a cyclical process. And same as the method, I feel DH is in a sense, and that sense is very much like there in my methodology. I need to understand this experience to see why we are coding what we are coding, and then whatever is being coded, how that reflects back. So in that methodology is that cyclical process of asking the tech question for humanities and vice versa. That's why I wanted to do it ethnographically, or at least qualitatively with participatory design researchers, etc. But it was not possible because, there was an access issue. But what I wanted to do was be in that space, see how they're thinking about things and how even teams are interacting with each other. I think that is very much a DH kind of work to do in the way I define. And yeah, that's it. Did I answer your question?
Wonderful, wonderful. And Setsuko, thank you so much for that question. It's a very important question. I also feel and that's my personal take, I feel there's a need to push back against what is understood to be normative DH methodologies. So I do feel in many ways, I think, and this is, again, you and I have had conversations on this, Setsuko, so I'm actually maybe repeating something that we've talked about. I think as digital humanists or occasional digital humanists, however we want to identify ourselves, we often become methodologists. We use methodologies that we feel are well suited to meet any research question, but we often forget that the research question is primary. So I think that's something that I feel should be brought back. But we have some lovely questions in the chat box that we want to start off with. There's a question. So Vasu, I would request maybe we can take both questions. I'll read it out and then you can take them one by one. So the first question is from Carl Onsu, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing. What is the reason for people to think that chatbot is the primary cause for suicides reported in the news? Is it validated? I think it brings in an important point around what is validation. Can there ever be causality, or is it correlation? And how is correlation talked about in these discourses? So maybe that's what I'm kind of extrapolating from the question. Then there's Justin's question, which is extremely important and a very key point. Justin Picard asks, these comments about language made me wonder about how this research looks like in India, specifically given the linguistic diversity and how so many mainstream, and in inverted commas, platform AI tools presume English as a starting point. Such a phenomenally important questions. Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Carl Onsu, for your questions. And I pass on to Vasundhra.
Thank you for that question. I would like to discuss the first question first. And there was recently an article just 2-3 days back, I think, and which the title was that if the effect of a chatbot or a technology is real, should we care that it's not real? So, and of course, you mentioned something about causality and correlation also. So I will not pull that string right now. But the fact is that people feel emotional distress and they reach out to it. The promise is not to get it all solved, but still engage in that conversation. For me, I think because there's distress is there and there's this promise of dealing with the distress is why people choose like the AI as a root cause of something like this. And it's
And
not.
Vasu, sorry, just to build on your point, and maybe if you could build on this further. So what you seem to be saying is that this correlation causality argument is not the important argument, which I agree with. I think the argument here needs to be that there are human lives at stake. So
Yeah.
that being the concern, we need to be talking about it. Am I getting you correct? Okay.
Yes,
fair.
yes.
Yeah.
Because, and then it goes back to the concerns I mentioned around literacy, around AI algorithms, what it actually can do and what it can't do. If we don't know about it, we're always going to be assuming it's going to fix something. And that's why I think the discourse comes around that there needs to be some onus on the users, but I don't think that is the case. I think the onus needs to be the people who are providing this to even get people to know this is the part that we can help you with, and this is the part we can't help you with. And after this intervention, you need to reach out to a professional to deal with these kinds of questions and concerns. I think some companies actually do that. After that, like after a certain point of time, they have like an SOS tag if the model can detect it, however they do. I'm not sure about the technicalities of it, but they do create like that checking point and break point after which it happens. I'm not sure how that actually happens, but I think it's still nice intervention to think about. So maybe it's not all validated, but because there's emotional distress and the question of human reflexivity and experience at stake, it's not wrong to like hold somebody accountable for a question and scenario like this. And Justin and I have spoken about these questions like a lot. I think only few companies now, one or two, are now introducing different languages into the therapy system. For example, DHAsia has launched Hindi models now. And to what I've spoken DHAsia about, they have a very like participatory design kind of processes around designing questions like these and conversations, which is a good step, but they do share a lot of problems around going with other, languages than English, because it is presumably the most common language in India at this point. And of course, it caters to a very centric group, like middle class, educated kind of group who only has education in India. And so linguistic diversity is a very big concern, and not just for these chatbots, but also for large language models. And there is a concern on adopting these large language models, which are trained on different languages for therapy, because some companies who are actually doing work in different manner do not agree with using language models, because they know that it comes with a lot of biases and a lot of problems, which means then they have to create a data set and model from scratch, which is a very, very long process. So there is a question about how you need to do it. And there are also, of course, there are also companies who would rather use the language models first, see how it works, and then start on basically fixing the problems and fine tuning, which is, it's kind of irresponsible thing to do. However, that's how companies are doing it in large language models research generally, not even coming to the complexity of that it brings to therapy models.
Yeah, and fantastic. Vasu, if I may kind of build on Justin's question a little bit, and because he's raised this key query around the privilege and capital of linguistic capital that comes in with these apps. Do you think in your fieldwork so far, and I know you're still in that process, that linguistic capital reflects in the privilege or the lack of privilege of people using AI apps? And how does that work?
Yeah, I think it does. Because a lot of people that I spoke to already, and because I reached out to them online, I couldn't get access to them offline also. A lot of them did work with like even Reddit forums and whatnot. So there is a certain level of privilege and capital incentive there. But I was looking for other people who are using this in different languages and trying to understand if they even would reach out to it at all. What do they perceive about AI? Actually, it took me to another sort of tangent debate where there were not many articles on critical AI literacy in Hindi. So I was just looking them up for my mother and trying to explain what I do and all. And that led me to this point where it was like, okay, even if linguistic diversity is there in providing this care, there's no understanding on, explaining how these work. So it eventually goes back to that. There is
So
certain
you bring the question back to socio-technical imaginaries, right? Like
yeah.
there's a certain socio-technical imaginary of a therapist or of AI, which is often difficult to map onto the role of a therapist.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting contestation, and I know this is a contestation that you'll talk about in detail in your work. As we are waiting for more questions from the chat room, maybe one more point that Vasundhra you could talk about. You seem to be talking quite a bit, even though it was a subtext. The idea around algorithmic literacies seem to be quite prominent in your conversation today, and it seemed like you were also making an argument for AI chatbots being a prime site to articulate algorithmic literacies. In many ways, a case study for algorithmic literacies, for that matter of fact. Do you want to build a little more on that? What do you mean by that? What could you talk? Could you talk a little more about that?
Wow. Can you make questions like a little more specific? It's so
Okay.
broad in my mind.
I know. My apologies, but
examples.
my question would be: can we use AI chatbots in public spaces or in classrooms to talk about how we need to be literate about algorithms? For example, we have courses and modules on media literacy, right? And we talk of media literacy, we use news platforms, we use fake news to talk about how disinformation, misinformation spreads. Similarly, primarily as a pedagogue, I see this as a wonderful site to talk about algorithmic literacies. I wanted to get your viewpoint on how that what process would come about in your thinking.
I think just sorry.
That's okay. You don't have to answer it. There's also people in the chat box. Jyoti has, you can take it together. I think Jyoti's raised her hand. So Jyoti, we give the floor to you.
Yeah, it's not related to this. And this is like a very, very interesting and very like relevant topic that you're dealing with. And I'm more curious about it, and I'm not sure whether I missed it in your presentation. So the kind of interviews that you're taking, are you looking at specific genders or any specific age groups? What is the kind of response that you're getting? Like, are there any gender specific experiences that people are having with AI therapy boards? And also, how do we get to know about such AI therapy boards? Like, I never heard about this before. So how do we get to know? Is there a platform or any database or any of that sort?
Okay, I will take that question. So in my interviews, because I was talking to people who are making these systems, I was actually like very much open. I put out an open call to everybody in the field, like from ethical AI responsible AI people who don't even work with healthcare or therapy models in general. But I put out an open call out to anybody because the market is so niche and my contacts were very limited. So in that things, if I were being very selective in choosing people, it might not have led me to even like any insight starting with, would have been taken a lot of time. It took me around like 2 to 3 months to reach out to sort of like the right people. I got an interview with a therapy chatbot company after 2 months into my work. Like I reached out to them, and then 2 months later, like an actual conversation happened. So I was open in terms of the position they're coming from, rather than position, I mean, their role in their companies and what they'd actually do, and then sort of build upon that and snowball through that. However, when you do mention about age and gender, etc., that is something that I kept for users, that if I do look for users, I might be able to do this. However, how to look for users would depend on putting out an open call and funding, which I did not have. So I thought that it might be relevant for me to put a focus group together and then have like different people in. For now, I've not done that part. But when you ask about that, does that play a role in how people are thinking about it? Let's speak from stakeholder perspective. It does a little bit, because how female psychologists or female programmers are thinking about it is a little different, and how male programmers might be thinking about it is a little Actually, it's not that different because everybody would kept going back to the one scripted line. We need somebody to talk to. So it was kind of frustrating at once. And I kept pushing them on like answering specifically in their like gendered context, but I would not get many sort of meaningful answers. I hope somebody talks to me about this later on, but right now I did not get much answer about it. They do talk about the biases in general about language models, but not about this particular thing. And then they would go back to, we are not using generative AI, we are not using this. We will be using it, but we are not using it right now. So we don't need to think about gender biases. That was something that I had like covered in a lot of interviews with people. And when you talk about how you can look these things up, I actually just like was curious because I was working on NLP models in general. So I thought about understanding where NLP is being used, and I stumbled onto therapy also because I worked with NLP models like natural language processing models, and they talk about emotion AI. Like that's the sub basically field, the subdomain, the umbrella field, emotion AI. So there are like these different tag words you can find. And right now, the screenshot that I showed, what you literally, if you go to Play Store and write AI therapy, you would get like so many models for it. And there's also therapy GPT. I was just checking it out like a few hours back. So it's just literally so accessible at this point that you don't even have to go look for it specifically. If you can combine different keywords, you might find different systems though. That would be very interesting because that's how I use different companies to find for my work. I was trying to build a list for companies. Then I thought I'd crowdsources, but when I was building that list, I used different keywords like for clinicians, was well-being. There are some applications, for example, for many specific mental health disorders also. So you can just like really search for that. I'm not sure how effective they are, please, but there are availability for this.
Yeah, thank you. Like, I'll go and play with it a bit. Like, I am interested about
Let
this.
me know how that goes. You can be one of my respondents then.
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful.
you.
As we thank you, Jyoti, for your question. As we wait for more questions, I think the conversation between Vasundhra and Jyoti reminded me when Tarleton Gillespie talks about the word algorithm in the book Digital Keywords. He talks about how the signified of the word algorithm changes from technical specialists to social scientists to the broader public. And of course, the word algorithm comes from the Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, who wrote this book called Hindu Art of Reckoning that got translated, and in Latinate, his name was Algorithme. And from there, we have the word algorithm. So it made me think about how different focus groups will have different signifieds of AI therapy chatbots, and how those signifieds might actually lead to different questions. So yeah, it's a very interesting, very great, wonderful question. I appreciate the viewpoint. Again, questions from the, okay, so Tomo Kumojima, again, my apologies if I'm mispronouncing, asks, thank you very much for your exciting research. What's happening in terms of legislation?
Oh yeah, that would be interesting. So I spoke to 2 lawyers and policy councils, and they were thinking about, and this is a big concern for me personally, because they're concerned about privacy, security. That is the primary concern that we are thinking about right now. And in terms of large language models and generative AI, India is doing something about it. It's very slow though, in my opinion, but we are doing something about it. However, I don't think we are tackling the development issues and the perspective that I shared right now. So in terms of the policy councils would just talk about clinical validation from psychological and medical practice point of view, that's not there. Some companies do have these different, and I keep forgetting the names of these like compliance method that they have to get approved by the medical board and all. After that approval only, they can launch these tools as medical interventions, otherwise not. Otherwise, they're just like chatbots, AI chatbots that you could talk to. That's not a medical therapy tool. So in terms of legislation, that is the kind of bar that they're taking at. And I think 1 or 2 companies are more or less going from their own on their own volition, actually, on their own ethical stances. For example, Visa, I found, is taking a very strong ethical stance on generative AI. And I've talked like more about this in detail with them also. And they keep mentioning these things on their own, on explainability, transparency. So in that kind of term, there's no legislation as such right now, but people are thinking about it. However, there are legal counsels who work in healthcare in general. And one of these person mentioned that the compliance and regulation that we think about, an accountability question that we think about in healthcare in general, and mental health care in general is a little different. And we don't know what this difference is basically stemming from. Maybe it's from the fact that we see other medical interventions as real, and mental health intervention is like not real. It's, it's abstract. So to map that kind of harm is such, maybe on a taking a perspective on it is a little different, which means accountability and legality means even like having a different stance on it. For example, the very simple example that she usually always points out is that a medical robot that is doing a surgery on you, you would have a very high stance on it. If you know that it's not working for 70% of the time, you will not get. But if you know that 70% of time that chatbot would still work, you would still take chance on the 30% because you get like some conversation. And it's not even about the distress at this point. It's just about having that conversation. So it becomes like so much more complex to navigate this, traverse this. And that's why regulation is a little halted on this thing, but they are working towards something. I found that the main concerns are always goes back to privacy and security. And even privacy is defined that is a whole different thing. Is privacy just making your name and number in a dashboard in a system? Is privacy the right to be left alone? What is privacy in that setting? So that is also very, very gray area. I'm sure I will not be able to map this in my PhD, but it's a very larger project. And I'm still curious of how different stakeholders and policy councils are working on this. I hope I laid out the map.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for that great question. We maybe have time for one more question, and then we do have to conclude. So if there's anyone who needs to or has a burning question with them, which they want to be answered or addressed in this conversation. Yeah, maybe last call going out. Great. Other than that, thank you so much again, Vasundhra. It's a fantastic talk. Of course, this is an exciting area of research. Many congratulations for all that you've done so far, all your successes, and we wish you all the best for the future. And I pass it back to Setsuko.
Thank you.
Yes, very exciting. And I'm still thinking about the cultural cause of empathy, what's being modeled after. Is it the therapist? Is it, what kind of expectations we have for these chatbots? So thank you so much, Vasundhra, for sharing your really, exciting work. And thank you, Dibya, for facilitating our conversations today. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for your intellectual generosity, for your questions, and for your engagement. I know you are, keen on keep thinking about these questions of therapy bots. So if you are not yet in our DHAsia Discord channel, I invite you to join us there so that we can continue on the conversation about therapy, both the algorithmic accountabilities, the role of DHs in the digital era that we are living in. So thank you once again, everybody, for coming today. Our next DHAsia webinar is going to take place in late November, probably, but I'm still working out the details. So please be on the lookout for the announcement in a few weeks' time. Okay, this is it. I'm going to call it a day so that we can, go on with our own dates. Thank you, Vasundhra, once again for sharing your work. And thank you, Dibya, for joining us so early in the morning. And thank you, everybody. Hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.